I think it's down to me, first of all, to explain what we think is the background to the exhibition and to Brian himself. The project really began some years back when Brian and I first met, and I have to say, as a curator, for many years before then, I've been thinking that I wanted to do an exhibition of the work of Brian Clarke for a number of reasons. First of all, the work itself is so spectacularly beautiful that it's the kind of art that's beyond explanation. It's Monet's water lilies, it's Lake Rembrandt, it's work that when you see it, it explains itself with a sense of euphoria. And the building we have in England, the Sainsbury Centre, very famously, is a huge open space which we felt would be enormously conducive to stained glass. But intellectually alongside that, we were interested in Brian because, and I think it spills over into the intellectual agenda at MAD as well, in that Brian has engaged seriously in a very major way with a whole range of the classic visual arts, the grand classic disciplines. And I think we'll talk to Brian in a minute, but it seems to me underpinning that, an enormously important painter through decades of practice. But very early on, stained glass became a principal vehicle for Brian's mode of expression. And we might say, very tragically in the modern period, that there weren't many more artists. Having said that, many of the great painters did engage, but we would consider from our end, and I certainly consider as the curator of the exhibition, for Brian to be by far the most important artist working with stained glass in the world today. For my own personal gratification as well, Brian has been engaging with ceramic, with mosaic, and with a range of the classic visual arts, which over the last several thousand years have formed a European and Western and world culture. So we felt at the Sainsbury Centre it would be a fantastic exhibition to do. I have to say also, early on, when we were looking to travel the exhibition, it occurred to us that the Museum of Arts and Design New York would be a perfect place, given the history and background of your institution, and given also your agenda of engaging in all of the arts and of treating all of the arts in equilibrium and thinking through the poetic discourses which each of the individual disciplines has. It occurred to us that that would be a perfect place to come. There's another reason as well. We love New York, and Brian personally has a big history in New York from your early days and then going forwards as well. So at one level, we felt we were coming home to Manhattan, that the agenda would be there. The interesting feature of that, of course, is that the spacing MAD is very different from the space it was in the UK, but it also occurred to us that stained glass is fantastically adaptable medium. It struck me pretty early on in discussions with Brian as well that the whole idea of modernity and stained glass, contemporary life and stained glass, of thinking of stained glass as a medium for our time. It's an art of light, which gives the name to the exhibition. And the idea, but alongside that, classically, it's been an art of narrative. It's been an art of storytelling. It's also been an art of abstraction. And uniquely amongst the arts, it functions outside of itself. Transillumination. Stained glass has the ability to throw its color across a space. And I have to say, the sheer poetry of when we started to install the screens at our institution, to see the light flowing out of them, was a pure joy. And then days after the exhibition opened, to see little children hopping around amongst the screens, and children and people lying down so that the colored light flowed over them, and so on and so forth. It occurred to us also with the colleagues at MAD, who've done a brilliant job with the exhibition, that by having a lighter floor, that sense of a transillumination of color floating off and making poetry in open space will be something you can all enjoy. I think also, before we bring Brian in to talk to us. There was something else. We're sitting here, of course, on an enormous sofa. We're not normally so unfriendly, the two of us. We're sitting here for all of our safeties. Is that the tragedy of this situation? It's probably visited New York worse than most places. It's visited London very badly, and we all know we're not through it yet. And it's raised very profound issues for all of us about the nature of life, the nature of culture, and the nature of how we conduct ourselves as a species, not simply as peoples in different countries. And it did seem to us also that because of that, coincidentally, there are grand themes in this exhibition which we think are suitable for the times, in that let's hope and pray that New York is now under control. We see the numbers, and we see that the numbers seem to be going down in New York. So let's hope that that continues on. But we talked for many hours when we first started to put the exhibition together with Brian and Brian's colleagues, because Brian has practiced seriously across a range of media. But it occurred to us with this exhibition that two bodies of work in particular put forward two very wonderful grand themes, which for me were hugely important. I myself am hugely interested in the emotional effect of the arts, about how the arts transform us. And we landed on two grand themes for this exhibition. The first, with Brian's magnificent screens, the first one made in 2015, and then since then a whole sequence of sheer euphoria, of coloured light spilling out of the screens, and the subject matter of each individual screen. Each one is in itself a freestanding creature with many ideas in it, but collectively they also generate an atmosphere which fills the space. And there's an emotional euphoria, and we can come back to it, but as I've already hinted, you get that a few times in life. Stepping inside the Orangerie, Monet's great masterpiece of water lilies in Paris, where you get swept over, and Goya's black paintings and so forth. And it seemed to me that the screens perform that each work is an individual masterpiece, but collectively. So the one grand theme of euphoria, and perhaps of hope and of joy. The other works, which Brian will talk to us about, were principally made with lead, the leaded works, and really explored and do explore ideas of memory, of loss, of memoriam, and of tragedy, of what it is as a human being to lose something, and to lose people in particular. So a deeply poetic and beautifully melancholic suite of works made over a period of years, which explore this notion of loss. And it occurred to us that by presenting them as two grand themes, this will carry the viewer through an emotional range, which was a wonderful way to experience Brian's work. And at MAD, we position them in two galleries. So you go from the one grand experience to the other grand experience. And there are other supplementary works supporting both themes on the walls, but that's the grand ambience of it. And of course, sadly for all of us, it couldn't be more appropriate. The sense of loss and of memory and of grief and of tragedy, which we're all visiting, but at the same time, we would hope of hope and a sense of joy and euphoria of what it is to be a human being. So the sense of yours and the two galleries is what we were aiming for. And very sadly, I myself, as a shielded individual, have not seen it yet. So I've only seen it at arm's length, but I have memories of it from my own institution. But I'm sure that ambience will be there. But I think that to bring Brian in now, and perhaps the first thing, Brian, is the stained glass and the leaded works. There's a hugely interesting story as to how the leaded works emerged, the two together. So I wondered if you could talk to the two gallery spaces and the emergence of the screens and the legibles.
I was just looking at the images that I think everybody can see at the moment.
All right, yeah.
And they are photographs taken during lockdown, that is since March, was it?
Yeah.
And I just want to go back to the things you said about COVID, which I think were particularly interesting in relation to these images as well. And that about a year ago, I started painting in a kind of frenzied, breathless way, really, poppies. And they became a vehicle to kind of describe all kinds of different feelings that one might be experiencing, particularly during these extraordinary and kind of delinquent times. And the story of the poppies and how they develop, and in terms of COVID, how one looks at oneself, is, I think, quite interesting. And I think there must be thousands of artists, hundreds of thousands of artists, millions of artists who have got their COVID stories. And in due course, those stories are going to be really interesting to hear, I think. But not all of them. There will be quite a lot of them that will be really interesting. And I think that for me, starting with those poppies in advance of the epidemic, the pandemic, back in Seville in the summer, and then working right through, continuing the same search, the same exploration, with the implications of how we're living and what we have to put up with now, quite naturally insinuating their way into the work through the back door. And I think that we've all experienced, in one way or another, changes in our psychology and the way we see things in the period of lockdown. And, you know, I like people, and I never like people more than when I'm alone. And when I'm solitary, I never like people less. You know, or have I got that the wrong way around? It's like, yeah, I always long for that which is not there. And during the period of lockdown, I think we've all been able to kind of look in a mirror and kind of get a more focused picture of who we are. And that draws a really appropriate analogy to the nature of the medium of stained glass. When I started doing stained glass, it was one of the big questions that I had to keep confronting was, is it possible to achieve the same level of intelligence, if you like, the same level of intimacy with your own nature in stained glass as it is in painting, as it is in sculpture, as it is in literature or poetry or art? And one constantly had to kind of fight to realistically and honestly answer that question. And so confronting the two extremities, the two polarities of the human condition, joy and grief, or victory and loss, or confronting that, and that's what it's an artist's job to try and deal with those issues, because on the whole we kind of brush under the carpet and we tend not to deal with it. Even if we're philosophers, there's a kind of preoccupation with process that denies the instinct from adding its own mercurial quality to reason and logic and giving us what we might be wisdom. And we know that that's possible in painting. We know from Rembrandt, and we know from Titian, and we know from Giotto, and we know from Dick Kooning and from Andy Warhol. We know that it is possible for painting and for two-dimensional graphic flat art to access those parts of the human condition that need to be commented on, or that we feel the need to comment on. And at first, I really wasn't sure whether stained glass held the potential for me to become a real artist, and satisfy all those needs. But then as I became more and more involved in the medium, something quite extraordinary to me. And that was that I found that if I wanted to make some kind of feeling or expression or statement in painting, I was often I felt limited relative to what I could do in stained glass. Because if you try and describe a kinetic event in painting, movement, it's an image of movement. It's an image, it's an idea of movement. It's an idea of change and time through space. But in stained glass, the movement really is there. And stained glass is in a constant change of flux. And you're very kind to describe me the way that you did in my relationship to the medium. But there are a lot of artists out there working with light and working with the medium of stained glass. And all of them really got bitten by the medium. Know that there is something that you can experience through this extraordinary thing that is not available through painting or sculpture. And there are things you can say with painting that you can't say. So what I'm saying is, I suppose, a long-winded way of saying that the medium is capable of addressing any aspect of the human condition.
And the screen, you developed the idea of the screen. The first one's 2015.
Well,
and is actually in the entranceway, I think, of Man's exhibition at Seville. Which gave you, and Michel described you, and it's a very interesting way. An architectural artist is an interesting description of your oeuvre in some ways. And the screen gave you the more than any other way of working with stained glass. It allowed you to produce works that, as with painting, could move around and could be juxtaposed. And that's 2015. So it must have been that must have been a very significant moment.
Well, I think it was. I think if you look at some of the 20th century artists and the 21st century artists who have worked with the medium, you know, Matisse decided right at the end of his life that his greatest works had been the works he'd done in stained glass. Chagall was at the end of his life said if he only discovered stained glass before then. And one of the problems with stained glass, as anybody who's dealt with the medium knows, is that the progress in developing your language, and I don't just mean the words or the vocabulary or the structuring or the syntax, but the whole language, that the only way you can develop a language that's capable of dealing with the important questions that we face as people is to do projects. And projects come in a kind of staccato way. You get one project and then it might be a year before you get another, and then suddenly you've got 10 projects, and then you've got a couple of years and you don't have any. But you need architectural locations, you need architectural context. It's an architectural medium essential. And what lit my fire at first about the nature of the Japanese folding screens back in the 60s or 70s, I don't know, when I was a kid, was that they had something fundamentally architectural about them. And it's always been in the back of my mind. In some of the first works I did in the 70s, I see some of the sketches for those things that made on screen. Some of the first works I did were kind of inspired by or triggered by Japanese screens. And then it occurred to me that when I do a large-scale architectural project, it allows me the wherewithal, the structure, the system, the infrastructure, the help, to advance an idea in the medium. But unlike painting, where you can just bang away at painting, in the last year I've made 600 large watercolors, 1.20 m by 80 each, just by constantly bashing away at it day and night and trying to find out what it is that's hiding around the corner that you're trying to kind of tease out. And in stained glass, it can't quite work like that, because it's down to how many commissions you get, how many architectural challenges you get. And so the screen, it kind of occurred to me, if I work on a screen and I put as much into the idea of that screen, the architectonic nature of what's happening inside those things, I could bypass the kind of years and years that because I'm constantly working on projects. but it's never enough in order to push the medium really forward. So by the introduction of screens, each screen represents an architectural opportunity or an architectonic challenge. And sometimes when I'm doing the screens, I imagine kind of classical architecture, the classical architecture of Asia Minor, the Hellenistic architecture of Greece. I imagine early Gothic architecture or English perpendicular architecture. I imagine Behrens or Mies van der Rohe or Bruno Taut or Norman Foster. Interesting, the pictures that the Sainsbury Centre, because there's no architect in the world actually that lends himself more to what it is I do than that. And looking at the Sainsbury Centre, which wasn't actually a collaboration, it was an exhibition no one's building, it gave me great pleasure, that shot from the outside. But the whole thing with screens is really developing language thing for them, trying to address different ideas from the algorithm, the matrix of the algorithm that gives one this extraordinary and unexpected sense of calm and security, to the kind of pop art expression of the sower at Canterbury Cathedral.
I think the idea was, I'd never thought so much about screens until I met you, I have to say. But as we talked about it, it started to occur to one that the screen is so incredibly important to the whole rise of modern architecture and design that in so many ways, Le Corbusier and Mies, it's about juxtaposition of planes. And they all love Japanese art and culture. And the idea that a screen carves up space and you see it from both sides, which with painting you don't get. And the idea that we would get these screens in Norman's cavern space, they sat so beautifully in the architecture. They became part of the architecture, didn't they?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a delicious moment when, as an artist, and you work in the medium of stained glass, you realize that the medium you are dealing with is actually volumetric. It's spatial. It's just flat art against a flat plane. It actually embraces architectural space and it transforms it. And once I've started trying, people always call the shafts of light that come through stained glass and play on a building structure. They always call them reflections, or the word is transillumination. And these wonderful transilluminations alter and change in the time that there's light coming through them. They become 100 or 150 or 1 million different experiences. Even at night time, when light is reflecting off them, they become multiple experiences. And so a stained glass window, and I mean, we can't get over the business of the church. We cannot get over the business of the stained glass and its relationship to ecclesiastical architecture. But at the Sainsbury Centre, somehow we really managed to do that. And funnily enough, of all the interviews that I subsequently read or listened to or watched, I'm always complaining that people relate stained glass to the church, but the only person who actually mentioned that relationship in all those interviews was me. And it did actually, once and for all, give considerable evidence at the Sainsbury Centre that the medium is capable of embracing any kind of architectural experience. And, you know, there are a lot of artists out there and students out there. The world's a really dismal place to be in at the moment. We all know. And art has an extraordinary and incomparable capacity for transforming the way we think about things and actually helping us to mold ourselves into who we are. And the closer we get to feeling who we are, the happier we are, the more useful we are, and of course, the more creative we are. And the nature of stained glass has a particularly kind of alchemical side to it, a particularly kind of magical side to it, a side that until you've seen it, you can't really understand all this bollocks I'm talking.
I couldn't, it's about being there, isn't it? I remember walking into the Sainsbury's Centre each day. I did. And the giant screen comes up from to put context for everyone. We put the glass screens in front of a giant window that the Sainsbury's Centre has, that the sun pours in through early in the morning, and we would often close that window at night, and then the screen would lift up so that the light came in and started to hit the screens. And it was an intensely emotional experience. I remember thinking that it's almost like an emotional euphoria not attached to any one subject. It's not as though there's a person there that you love or that you've seen something. It's just, it almost permeates into you, like seeing a sunset. It's a subject matter in itself, the transillumination.
Yeah,
it has the capability of lifting.
Because the glass itself is, I'm sorry, what? I'm sorry, I'm not addressing the microphone. Sorry if you lost my voice there. One's always got to remember that glass is a supercooled liquid. And as I always say, I don't really understand what that means. I don't really understand physics. And I've had a couple of very eminent physicists explain to me about the supercooled nature of glass and the fact that it is always liquid. And yet I can feel that anybody who's dealt with the medium and looked into the medium is aware of that liquid nature. And that very liquid, moving nature reminds one of the kind of essence of world, like the world exploded into being in some way. And when you look into microglass glass, you see that explosion, you see the bubbles, the striations, you see the white heat of creation coming out of it. And yet it can be delicate. It can be gentle, it can be passive, it can be submissive, or it can be authoritative and dynamic. And the colours can overwhelm you. And it's one of the problems with the medium. It's so easy to look good in stained glass because the medium is so great. But you get a lot of really crappy stained glass. And people love it because they look at the transillumination. Interesting idea that I've been playing with recently is designing a stained glass window going from the transillumination back. So I've been looking at certain interior spaces and thinking, what would I like to add to these spaces in terms of the transilluminated impact dancing across this interior? And you begin to take it back from that to the flat art is a very interesting experience. And ideas have started coming up, particularly recently when I've been painting with watercolors, which is a kind of transparent medium. The light goes through the pigment, bounces off the white surface and comes back. And I've begun to realize that there is a great untapped area of how you deal architectonically with volume as an artist, as a painter, as a flat artist. And this experiment of trying to create the mood and then take it back. And of course, there are many moods you don't expect, like when the winter comes or the autumn, or there is a pedestrian movement across a vertical plane or a tide movement across a skyline. Unexpected, the world kind of gets interfering with it. And it really is kinetic. I mean, Isazaki used to say he only liked really looking at my work, or best liked looking at my work, on a screen or on a projection, because the light was passing through them in its colour. And I think that.
I think the way you describe it is the dry. I remember talking to an old photographer. But the whole thing I like about ceramics that makes it better is that you couldn't be any uglier than a pile of mud, which is what you start with. And so it can only get better. When you start with glass, it's intrinsically beautiful to begin with. And it's a challenge for the artists as to how they engage with it. That may or may not be true, but it's an intrinsically, that notion of a super cool liquid, which I agree with you, it's very hard to grasp.
It is, isn't it?
It's a poetry in itself.
But somehow instinctively, even though I'm not in a position to explain in physics.
Brian, can you, going on to the Ledyworks and the logic where the Ledyworks came from, can you describe to our our audience?
Well, you know, you should understand a little bit of a background. That stained glass remained, but it was responsible for producing some of the greatest works of art in our cultural history. Certainly the greatest works of art of the medieval period, and perhaps even the 9th century. Even though it went through that development, an enormous seismic shift occurred in the aftermath of the Second World War in Germany, and dragging down the influences from Toorn-Pricker and Campendonk and Meistermann and the Wiener Werkstatt and the Bauhaus and so on, dragging that all down, a group of essentially Rhinelandish artists in Germany turned the medium on its head by making the lead a calligraphic expression in its own right, by using opal glasses so that you don't see through them, and so on. And so there was a huge, enormous change. And though there had been a lot of contributions to the medium from great artists like Matisse, Léger, Cocteau, Hussar, Coleman, Moser, Klimt, Burne-Jones, you know, I could just go on forever and ever. It's a very long list. Not many of them have done enough in the medium to actually drag it. Well, what were we talking about?
The leaded works.
Oh, the leaded works. And so you try to take the medium to different places. And if you look at Saint-Paul de Vence, that was a Matisse's work at Vence was dramatically, it was a big moment. And what do you want? Well, the lead became such an important factor because it was about wine. And in the post-war movement of stained glass, it all became about wine, really. And colour was a graphic device to fill in certain bits between the lines. Yeah. And it simply became a flat graphic device. And this thing that animated the history of stained glass was you know, relegated in a way to a secondary role.
But we're right, I think in the history, the lead allowed you to put different,
it's what held together. It's a section that is in an H section, and you split the pieces of glass into side of it, and they are the structural elements that hold the window together. But when it started being seen as an element in itself,
a way of drawing.
Yeah, a way of drawing, and this predated the post-war Germans, in fact, but they were the real kind of flowering of it. Really, that's all. At the age of, as a teenager, as a young guy, when I was really interested in stained glass, and I saw these extraordinary things by Clarke and Meistermann in Germany, it really fired me. And it fired me with an enthusiasm that was only equal to the difficulties I had in rejecting it later in order to move the thing forward. And
so a period came where...
Well, there was a period where I removed lead entirely from the equation.
The technology and your artistic development, lead disappeared. And
about 30 years ago, it started becoming possible to do large-scale things on fluid glass. And then the opportunities became greater. And of course, if you can work on floor glass, you can work with curtain wall buildings, you can work with the language of modern architecture. And the
Brian has made the largest pieces of stained glass, particular pieces of stained glass without lead, are yours.
Sorry, probably, but then came this other idea. Well, what if we've removed glass? We've removed lead from the equation. What if we remove glass from the equation? And you just get a leaded one? And that allowed one to explore a very different kind of thing, if you like, a calligraphic thing. But a line can carry an immense amount of thought and reason and emotion and anger, fury, and delicacy, tenderness. And if you marry that to the extraordinary potential of colour, and I know that in today's society, colour is the fallen angel of some consumer demagogy. Anything that's coloured, we're almost immediately a little bit suspicious of, because it lacks this, or it certainly was like that in the past as well, during minimalist art, the period of reductive art. And so the lead works really became a means of expressing darker sides. You know,
what I found most spectacular about them when one came across them in the storage areas in the studio, and they started to imagine how we could create a kind of contiguous installation of works almost just purely with the lead, is that they're clearly powerfully about stained glass. They're stained glass without stained glass in a very
they've
complex.
always been made by stained glass craftsmen.
Yeah.
And they're quite good to also performances. Yeah.
And then the symbolism of lead, which somehow there is something dark about lead.
Yeah, they designed coffins with it. Yeah.
Something ancient and something dark, and that sense of exploring the self and mortality and so forth, and the poetry.
I mean, I guess what the most important thing really is that if there's anything worth saying, then it is this, that the medium of stained glass, and I want as many people as possible to explore this medium. I share the excitement that anybody who has felt this shares. And the medium lends itself to discovering parts about your own nature that you were unaware of. It lends itself to looking not only literally through glass to the distance, but metaphorically through a window into a different world. And that different world is a poetic experience. It's an experience. You know, somebody, a very close friend of mine, family really, has recently had a terrible bereavement. And he sent me a photograph this morning of one of my stained glass windows in a private house in Chiswick in London. And it's a page from the English book prose of poetry, the Oxford poetry. And it is Christina Rossetti's Remember. And it occurred to me, at moments when human life is really difficult and makes us really challenge and question whether there's any point to it, art comes to the rescue. And then Christina Rossetti's extraordinary poem, Remember, and I encourage everybody who's watching to just look it up, Christina Rossetti's Remember. And it's a call from the other side of life, from the other side of death, of how someone doesn't want the people they've left behind to suffer. And there is a linear, beautiful truth in Rossetti's poem that only art is capable of delivering. It's like a jewel, it's like some faceted, precious stone that you can only find in art. And it has a real usefulness. Art's not about just being entertaining and about being beguiling and burnishing and ornamenting and decorating our daily lives. It's also about reminding us how significant truth is and how only through completely embracing like what's really true, being honest with ourselves, not fucking around, not buying into bullshit, but we can move we can actually find out who we are.
When the two of us were talking on the arm around the exhibition at the Sainsbury Centre, and you've repeatedly been in New York, John Donne's poem, The Valediction of Weeping, of one of the greatest poems about grief and loss, but tinged with a sense of hope.
And you had this in the centre.
And we put it on the wall, and it is on the wall in the gallery in New York as well, because several of the screens, and particularly one, the green screen, has teardrops. And the poem is about a lament. It's a lament in the discourse on seeing his lover's tears and seeing his face reflected in them. So it's about parting and loss. But it just reinforces that idea that there's a very powerful poetry and literature, a sense of literariness underpinning the thing.
And I think that, you know, those drawings that I translated into glass in what is actually called the grief screen, they were agonizing to make. I made them actually in Southeast Asia, in the Indian Ocean, after a particularly horrific series of bereavements that I suffered. And I drew myself crying in a mirror. And it's kind of embarrassing to talk about now, but we need to talk about such things. So, and I can't look at that screen because it triggers so many memories. It resonates with so many deeply felt agonies.
And apologies to interrupt everybody, but with this point about loss, I will have to insert myself and say that we have just about 5 minutes left.
We're not even started yet.
Oh, well, I was just saying.
That was just the introduction.
I was just saying about the nature of grief, and we can take ourselves very seriously about it, and grief is a very significant thing. But my lovely Auntie Mary came along to the Sainsbury Centre and looked at the screen that contains the images of the explosion of Hiroshima, and said, I like the broccoli screen, but I don't like the scream of that. I don't like the scream of that man laughing. Well, they were images of my greatest sorrow, and I think it's also important not to take yourself too seriously. That was the point of that before I think Lydia drew us to attention.
One thing, the two grand themes of the exhibitions in New York, folks, and I hope you enjoyed Brian elucidating about that. But before we move into questions, it'd be nice to look at your artistic formation somewhat, because I've noticed things coming up from throughout your career, Brian, and many pictures of you look, in successive grand styles from the 60s to the 90s, and I found especially interesting your description of punk and pop, but especially, as it were, because you tend not to think of stained glass and punk rock in the same way, that's for sure, or of paganism in the same way, but a sense of contrariness which enters into the composition and so forth. But anyway, the punk years were important for you.
Yeah, they were the years where I actually worked out what it was to be an artist. And before that, I was working out how you technically became an artist, how you developed certain skills that would allow you to say important things if you were lucky enough ever to think any important thoughts. And punk rock, at a time of the most appalling malaise of mediocrity in the art world and the music world in the 1970s, came along like a hurricane pregnant with possibility. And art was dragged away from the museums and away from rich folk, and it was on the streets. And I think that was one of the most significant working class movements that occurred in my lifetime. And I consider myself a working class artist. And I know that my success renders it absurd for me to call myself working class in that sense, but I hold to working class principles. I am proud of being working class, and I believe art almost always comes out of its belly.
Well, it also raises the issue about who art is for. And maybe we're both fans of William Morris and of the grand move of the late 19th century. What business have we with art unless we can all share it? That notion of creating artworks that can be as deep and complex as you like. It's still possible to make art that can transform a society as well. Stained glass as one of the greatest arts through history in terms of its universal reception. People love it and continue to love it in all contexts, and I'm sure they will here as well. But as we could see these images coming up, for me, the interesting moment in the New York years is there's something about that impacted you visually in the punk, in terms of a sense of contradiction and contrariness in composition and approach to art. Quite often I find in the works and the paintings of the period that you set up a proposition visually and then deliberately and cleverly subvert it in some way.
Yeah, there's always a kind of close liaison between chaos and order, between instinct and reason, between structure and liquidness. There's always a kind of fight between those two, and somewhere lying in the land between those two experiences, almost, the fingers almost touch, and it's really very magical.
And in some ways, I think also as one looks at your work, a profound rejection of the idea that there's a fundamental space between abstraction and representation, which many of us were taught as we were trained in the 70s, that abstraction is to do with progress in the future and that's it. Representation is something else altogether. Figurative art, it's either of the past or it's a different. And it seems to me throughout you're very happy to deal with both in a highly complex and interesting way.
I think that when I started really finding myself as an artist, I was definitely an abstract artist. But I was born in the time of pop art. As a student, our heroes, the people that were really exciting us, were pop artists. And but I started developing an abstract language. And once I developed it, I kind of got recognized for it. And there was a little bit of, there was a little bit of encouragement from art dealers I work with to kind of hold on to this recognizable signature. And I did feel rather uncomfortable for a while about how often I seemed to change and move from this idea to that idea. And then it kind of dawned on me that even artists as successful, and believe me, I'm not comparing myself to them, you can believe that, if you believe anything, but Picasso and Gerhard Richter make these great movements. There are many artists who make these changes and table hop through culture. And I certainly feel like there is an immense reservoir of material out there. Some of it is non-objective and some of it is figurative. Some of it is romantic and actually embraces the romantic ideals, and some of it is constructivist and based on architectonic principles. And there are no rules. I'm not allowed not to fish over there. If by fishing over there, I get the right result. And I feel very comfortable in my own skin now about drawing on anything that helps me do the job better and more usefully.
Fantastic. I'm so sorry if I can interrupt for 1 second. It is just about time to move on to the question and answer, and perhaps this idea of feeling so comfortable within your own skin and your own identity as an artist is a perfect place to start. But can I give you any final comments before we do move on?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I had to interrupt.
There's one more point which I think, as we've all watched the images go past and listened to Brian describing his work, the notion of Gesamtkunstwerk, of the work of art, which is a concept that some of us are interested in, with Brian, that is the coming together of grand disciplines. We can see dancers there with Brian behind. A coming together of all of the arts, ceramics, glass, metal, architecture, sculpture, painting, stained glass, and so on and so on, orchestrated into a whole, which is an idea that really came from opera in the late 19th century and was important for many of the modernists.
Yeah, it means simply an entire work of art. Work of art embraces everything, not just, you don't just go into a room and put art on the wall or on the table. The whole experience is art. And I do very much like to work with that. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there who like that kind of experience too. I'd love to hear from them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Get through the space between art and life, isn't it?
So let's see, if you don't mind, we've had some really juicy questions coming in and a couple of nice compliments coming through the chat. But how about for this first one? And we'll do this for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll bring on our special guest to close out the program. So for our first question, Brian, your art is clearly contemporary and modern. So much of modern art has to do with minimalism, and yet you are in the realm that is highly ornate and decorative. Could you say something to address that?
Yeah, well, I can point to works of mine that could loosely fall into the category of minimalism. And of course, there is a kind of confusion about ornamental art and decorative art, and the sort of absurd hierarchy about where the one begins and fine art ends and so on. I think that there are occasions, particularly in architectural experiences, where the need, the prevailing imperative is that the art should be reductive, gentle, contemplative, and minimal. And when the experience calls for that, I deliver that.
Yeah.
There are other occasions where you want an exuberant explosion of a belief that there is real joy in it, and that only by embracing that joy can you really express it. And that really seeks then to something else. And I don't want to be the last minimalist on the block, and I don't want to be the last ornamentalist on the block. You know, I'll dip into, you know, look how great Matisse's line drawings were, simple line drawings, and how spectacular his stained glass and his great kind of florid or arabesque ornamental paintings were. I mean, you can move from one extreme to the other, and you can dance in between two. And I think the idea that you have to get one idea and then flog it to death, so your entire life, is basically, you know, a very good way of wasting your life.
Right. So here's another question, and this is from my guest, Maria. I noticed some of your older work here. What was your inspiration for working with dots printing method instead of traditional stained glass window technique? Could you also talk more about your use of the cross? Thank you.
I love the Ben-Day dot, and I love the things that Roy Lichtenstein was talking about. And when it occurred to me that by putting the Ben-Day dots, these are the dots that were used in old-fashioned press printing in order to create a figurative image. And of course, the further away you get from it, the clearer it becomes. And it was a frequently used device in pop art. And so I grew up acquainted with that vocabulary. And I used to even draw with dots in a kind of odd, kind of pointillist way to try and create images out of them. I've always liked that build-up. I mean, I think a lot of people find it very appealing. But when I discovered by putting different colored dots in layers behind each other, you could create a kind of oscillation, a movement, and not unlike, you were talking about Monet's lilies in the Tuileries, but not unlike the way those lilies hover. And you can get an oscillation, something more of a mirage than an image. And particularly, I know I should be shocked at that, I'm sorry. I did.
We'll let you off for that.
Yeah, but the layering of colour in those Ben-Day dot matrices is infinitely. I would still like to do more of it. I'm interested. The question interests me greatly. I wish I could talk on about it.
The gorgeous is the pointillist, that that Seurat generation played with different things, but not in stained glass, tragically.
Well, it was used in stained glass. I thought I was the first to use that in stained glass, but I wasn't. Joachim Close did it before me. I think by like a year or something. But my first one was 1971. The first one I did in stained glass was 71, and I think Joachim did it around. Joachim Close, who's deceased now. I think he used it a bit, maybe a bit before, about the same time. Anyway, I will take credit for it, but I've always loved it.
All right, I have another question. Brian, you're trained as a painter. Could you say something about painting in relationship to your stained glass work? And I know we touched on this a little bit in the conversation.
In my experience, painting, and every artist is different. There are as many different kinds of artists as there are. And all of us are struggling to get past Picasso and past the next thing and do something that's just us. And painting is a very efficient way. People have been saying that painting is dead. But every 10 years, certainly in my lifetime, it's died every 10 years and then risen again. And it is it remains one of the most efficient ways of getting your thoughts down quickly and permanently. And if you work at it, those thoughts can become complex and developed. And it provides you with an enormous reservoir of material to dig into. So I paint all the time, I draw all the time, and the ideas born in those paintings and drawings usually find their way ultimately into stained glass. And I get so fed up with the art world's snootiness about stained glass as a medium. You know, that I started, and I've been told by so many art dealers to kind of play the stained glass down in order to play the paintings up. But I've now started entitling all my paintings, I give them a title, and then in parentheses it says after all the study for stained glass. And
the watercolours, Ryan, they have the potential to go literally straight into the
well, I think about them in those terms, particularly the poppies that have been done in this last 12 months. Yeah, I think about them in terms of stained glass and painting.
Fabulous. And then I have another interesting question. This is from Ralph Gibson. Brian, looking at your watercolors on the screen caused me to wonder if the translucency of watercolor translates directly into stained glass.
It absolutely does. I think I know about light. It's a little photography friends than I've learned from anywhere. And of course, you're absolutely right, Ralph. Watercolor, the stained glass is rendered visible by virtue of light passing through a membrane of color. A painting is rendered visible by light reflecting off the surface of the painting. And watercolor forms a thin pigment over a light ground, the paper. And the light passes through the pigment and comes back off the paper, so it replicates. It approximates the stained glass. It's an extremely good analogy for the medium. And when I'm making the watercolors, I think very often of how they will be in glass and vice versa.
Fantastic. So I think we have time for let's try one more. And this is from an anonymous attendee. For commissions, when you're working with people who are commissioning your work, either in architecture, how much are you relying on the commissioner's vision? How much of that is collaborative? What is that process?
It's very difficult to do a great project without a great patron. And the really great patrons are the people who recognize the skills that they need to have employed in their buildings and then let the artist get on with it. Most of the time, the people who commission works of art from Long think they know what they want, but in fact, you've got to tease out of the process not what they want, and not really what you want, but what the situation needs. And commissioned work has never been a problem for me. I will bend over backwards in order to make something work if I'm working on a commission. But that's called collaboration. And then there's another rather more mischievous element that comes in, and that's called compromise. And once you compromise, you're buggered, really. Once you've tasted of that evil fruit, you really going to find it very difficult to go back. But I've had some really great patrons in my life who have not in any way, who really inspired the best out of me, frankly, who really have. And they've always been the ones to whom it is a conversation. When I have somebody come to me and says, I want this, we either never end up doing anything at all, or the this he wants becomes that. And sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't, I suppose. But a great patron is like a great artist, because in both you require considerable self-confidence and, in order to function usefully, considerable modesty. And you just do. And great patrons always have those twin qualities, I think.
It's something we notice in the history of art, isn't it? I'm thinking of the Art Nouveau generation, wonderful architecture at the end of the 90s. It needed massive vision on the part of the people who commissioned it and ran with it when we think about it. And I think it's the same with Brian, that the history of art shows us that without clever patronage and sensitive patronage that understands what an artist is, it's intrinsic to the history of art. It's a collaboration.
Yeah, that's when it becomes truly collaborative. And the crafts, by which I mean any enterprise that involves the making of things by a human being in collaboration with another human being, whether you're designing a stage set or a painting or a mosaic or costumes, whatever it is. In fact, there's a nice story that illustrates, if I may, a very brief one. And when I finished painting the stage sets for Paul McCartney's World Tour, in the late 80s or early 90s, and they were very big sets, particularly by those days standards. And Paul was always encouraging, never got in the way or tried to impose, because he's an artist, he gets it. And when I finally finished the designs, Paul said to me, because he would of course be standing in front of them in the performances in the stadium, when he finally saw my finished designs, he said, "I'll be proud to turn my back on it."
Fantastic.
That sums up that's the kind of patron you want. Somebody that encourages you and then they exist.
Absolutely. So I'm
exactly. I'm sure you will say. I think
so,
it's objects, isn't it?
Yes.
All is that I'm not stood over there with you, David. I'm civil.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it. What was the last thing you said?
We were talking about great papers and thank you, David, and Civil Yeoman.
Yes.
One of the very sad things is that it takes us
Exactly. So I'm sorry that we don't have any more time for questions. Thank you, everyone, for their great questions, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours. Thank you both to Paul and Brian, and in just a moment, I will bring on David Yurman, who will close us out for the program. But in that spirit of collaboration that we were just talking about, thank you so much for bringing us in to your collaboration. And also, I have to say thank you so much for this beautiful show that we have up at the Museum of Arts and Design. For those of you, I think we're all members here, please do email that patrons@Mad Museum email address and reserve your tickets for the member preview. And now I will bring on David Yurman. Let's see if we can get him up. There you are. Hello, David. It looks like you'll need to unmute your microphone. Hello, everyone, and this is artist, designer, and founder of David Yurman, David Yurman.
Oh. I'm unmuted.
You're perfect.
Am I unmuted?
You're great.
I tell you, besides being unmuted, I'm overwhelmed, flabbergasted at the breadth and greatness. I very seldom use the word greatness of Brian Clarke's work. The breadth is just, Brian, you're a goddamn genius. You are absolutely a genius. You are, if you were a scientist, you would be having Nobel Awards back to back, if that is even possible. I'm so impressed and so in love with what you do. It brings light into my heart. It is so diverse, not only in the material, but it is so diverse in point of view. You have almost no boundaries other than the material boundaries. And you have just great intuitions, ingenuity, the ability to live with no rules. That's because you know what the rules are. You can live without them, and you can go through them and past them. They're not limitations. They're things to play with. So I congratulate you, and I am so honored. Sybil and I are. My wife, who's off doing something. We are very touched to be chosen by Paul to be in the position to sponsor this exhibition at MAD's Museum of Art and Design in New York, and a long time coming, really a long time coming. I'm sorry, it wasn't my fault. The opportunity is more than just the funding. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to collaborate in any way, just sit down, have a cup of tea or coffee and speak with each other before this. But the connection that I have, that's the deepest of what you've said is that the difference between craft and art, why do we have to even talk about that? It's what we do with our hands. We make things and we feel things and we breathe them to life. And whether we do them by ourselves or have teams, your connection to your expression is such a just open river, a torrent of creativity. I don't know what to say. I'm so moved by it. I'm seldom sort of like lost for words, because everything you've done, you cannot put you in a box. He's a this, he's a that. He's an artist. He's curious, and he does beautiful work. End of story. And he's doing stained glass. You could be doing paper and twine, but you're not. But you might, because it is your way of expressing. And I think at this time, for anyone who is in New York now, or would come to New York, you must come and see this. Your work is phenomenal. I'd like to be closer to it. So Brian and Paul Greenhalgh, my dear friend, who encourages me all the time and have great chats. It's really important to see what the genius of art and material can do to bring warmth and hope into our lives during this COVID moment. So it's so fortuitous that this exhibition is happening now, because we need that. We need the sunlight of your creativity, of everyone's creativity. So I'm deeply touched. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you all for sticking with it. We've had a number of questions in the chat about adding this to make it available afterwards, and we'll get back to you on that. But thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Brian, for that beautiful show. And we will speak to all of you soon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Paul. Bye, Brian.